This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. It's another in my series of great television programs. The subject is The White Shadow, a 1970s drama on CBS, and I will be speaking with two people who are in agreement with me that it is a great show. Harv Aronson and Hal Horn are my guests. They will be speaking about the 1970s television drama The White Shadow with me. I usually like to give my guests the opportunity to define themselves, who they are, what they do, and their relation to the subject matter, and that's what I'm going to do right now. So, Harv Aronson, welcome. If you can give a little bit of background about who you are, what you do, and anything you want to say opening about The White Shadow.
Sure. Born and raised in Pittsburgh, living in Florida now. I work for a financial company, but I'm a sports writer as well. And grew up with The White Shadow. I'll be 66 this year. So it was interesting. I found out that Timothy Van Patten, when he was recording the show, was the same age as me. So it was very easy to relate to that show. And I just recently watched old episodes, and I know why now. I always thought that was a great show. It's just fantastic. So yeah, that's a big fan of White Shadow.
My other guest is Hal Horn. This is his second appearance in my show. So Hal, same question. Who are you? What do you do? And any opening comments you have about The White Shadow?
Sure thing, and thanks for the invite, Dan. I do the Horn Section blog spot. Been doing it since 2006, and I'm 56, about to turn 57. So the White Shadow had quite an impact on me. I was 10 years old the year that it premiered, and I wrote about it in 2006, one of the first subjects for my blog. I do a lot of classic TV in that, episode guides to a lot of old shows these days, and also a lot of cult movies. As for The White Shadow itself, like Harv, I've recently binge watched quite a bit of the first three seasons, or the three seasons, that's all we got, and find that it not only holds up remarkably well, it's actually even better than I remembered in hindsight. It's 45 years after it premiered, to have a number of episodes that still retain relevance is pretty remarkable, I'd say.
Well, I'm 60, so I split the difference between you guys. And the reason I like the show and even recognized its quality back then, long before I was interested in the arts, was I grew up in inner city, New York City, on the Brooklyn-Queens border. So I went to what at the time was the biggest and probably the most corrupt and violent high school in the 60s, 70s, 80s, Franklin K. Lane High School. They even at one point wrote a book about the race riots that went on there, and I could get into it all. But this was the first show, other than Bill Cosby's cartoon Fat Albert and the Albert Kids, that showed inner city life. And even though the majority of the cast was black, 80% of the cast was black, I knew black kids. I grew up with them. I knew, this was my métier, unlike any other shows, even some great shows. But this one personally spoke to me more than any other show. I, in fact, did try out in, I think it was my second year of high school, which would have actually, I did 3 years of high school, 3 years of junior high. So would have been what would it have been, my junior year there. I tried out. There were 84 kids tried out for the team. I was the 26th cut, meaning I was better than 58, but still nowhere near the top 11 that would have made it. But anyway, that's why I wanted to talk about The White Shadow. So why don't we talk a little bit about how the show came to be? Ken Howard was basically a theater actor, well known, well respected throughout L.A., New York, all around the country. But this was, in a sense, his first big break as the star of a show. Harv, do you want to talk a little bit about who Ken Howard was, and the show, The White Shadow, the name, supposedly came from his own personal experience?
That's right. And I didn't realize that he was that tall. I think he was 6'6".
Yeah.
He actually played some college ball. And I understand from reading his background that, yeah, he was one of the only white basketball players. So they called him the White Shadow, and it carried over to the name of the show. But he did a fantastic job in that show. Great actor. Unfortunately, he passed a few years back, but he did. He carried over his background into that show, and I think a lot of the storylines could have come from that background as well.
Also, this was, well, Hal, do you have a comment? Go ahead.
Oh yeah, now he had been in a series before, but it didn't succeed nearly as well, called Manhunter.
Oh, really?
And got some recognition for that, but it didn't last long, less than a season, as I recall. The White Shadow was his first big success, though, for sure.
So it also bears pointing out the producer of the show was Bruce Paltrow, now known basically as Gwyneth Paltrow's father. But anyway, this was his also, I think, first successful show, and he came for the next 20, 25 years till he died, had a number of hits, St. Elsewhere probably being the most well-known and well-remembered. But do we know the story of how Howard met Paltrow? How how was it Howard pitching it to Paltrow, and then he pitched it around to the networks? Or what's the story there, either of you?
Well, obviously, Paltrow created it after discussions with Howard, but the idea was largely Howard's. Of course, pitching it to the network, I think I'd give the credit to Paltrow for that, for sure.
Harv, any comment?
Yeah, we're thankful for that. It was a good show. Yeah, I mean, I was kind of surprised. I remember seeing the show, but I didn't realize it only lasted 3 seasons. And that's unfortunate.
Probably the only negative that I can think of on the show was that it went through the whole thing of having actors in their sometimes mid-20s, early 30s playing high schoolers. Same thing that what was it? The Sweat Hogs. Welcome Back, Kotter had the same thing. I think the guy who played Freddie Washington was like 30, and in that one. But other than that, I think it was one of the first shows that really heralded a sense of realism. An earlier show that was a sitcom earlier in the decade was Room 222. And that was also set in an LA high school. And I enjoyed that as a kid too. But while they did deal with some social issues, there were always sub-stories or secondary stories that were humorous. Whereas this show, I think, ushered in the realism. It's almost always credited to what is it? Was it not L.A. Law? Hill Street Blues is often credited as bringing it realism. But The White Shadow was 2 or 3 years before, and I think it had quite a bit of impact too, because it dealt with racism, abortion, it dealt with sexism, it dealt with drug abuse, it dealt with suicide, it dealt with a whole host of things that are part of the human condition from eons ago till now, half a century later almost. Harv, what do you think was the thing that set this show apart from maybe other earlier shows that could have dealt with similar things? And do you agree with me that it was one of the early shows that ushered in realism even before Hill Street Blues?
Absolutely. Watching back the old episodes, I was like, gosh, they touched on real life situations and they played them out perfectly. I mean, it seemed real, and the storylines were great, because they dealt with societal problems, personal problems, all these different things. It's interesting because I remember reading a review of one of the series, and somebody said, "What's that killing off Curtis Jackson?" And that show went downhill. And I got through the first 2 seasons, and then the 3rd season after that episode, it really did become, not so serious of a show and more got off topic of basketball and personal issues. But the first 2 seasons were fantastic.
Yeah. How?
Yeah. We talked about the realism, and it absolutely was groundbreaking. Might have been too realistic for its own good. Now, I'm not talking about the subjects that it would tackle. But in the arc that, to expand on what Harv just said, the climax of the show was indeed the episode with the tragic death of Curtis Jackson on the eve of the city championship. And when I talk about too realistic for its own good, it was extremely realistic to have a sense of anticlimax after that championship, because that was what 2 years had been building up towards. Of course, a tragedy puts a damper on it right before it happens. And then after that, well, realistically, it's not the end of the season, just like the end of basketball season is not the end of the school year. There's still a couple of months to go. So there were a couple of episodes that dealt with, one was kind of ill-conceived, Coolidge getting a part on a TV show, and that one's, I mean, there were some valid points to make in that series, and in a far better way than Bamboozled would 2 decades later, in my opinion, far more subtle. But, you know, the 2 episodes that were remaining did not stand up to the 22 before it that season. And then you get to season 3, which I'm watching it again. I'm a little kinder to it now, but it was still realistically anticlimactic because the championship's been won, and now some key players have graduated. You mentioned Welcome Back, Cotter. Well, nobody ever graduated. You know, 4 years later, we're all still in high school, looking like, you know, we're 30. The White Shadow graduated several of its key players, so there were many new faces to get to know. They still had Salami and Coolidge around for continuity. They were, I guess, in their senior year at that point, but you had multiple new players. The audience, of course, a little bit jolted by that. Audiences then particularly liked continuity. But you'd won the championship, and now, realistically, just like high school and college champions in real life, you're starting all over again. And the audience just wasn't, I don't think, used to having so many new characters introduced that early in the run of a series. That probably hastened its demise, in my opinion.
I thought it was kind of neat, though, the very final episode, how they paid a visit to Curtis's gravestone. I thought that was kind of a nice touch to the finale. So
yes.
Yeah. Do you think that the very nature of the setup, that you have characters that are aging and going to naturally age out of the drama, since the main character is always going to be the coach, because the titular main character, that's who he was. I can only think of one television series that I've ever watched that was able to do that, and that was, if you're familiar, I don't know if you're familiar with the Canadian television franchise, the Degrassi franchise. Degrassi, it was the kids of Degrassi Street, then it was Degrassi Junior High, Degrassi High, and then 20 years later, Degrassi The Next Generation, where they every year a portion of the cast graduated or went off, and you'd get to know new kids. With this, since we're not talking with a whole high school, this is just the basketball team, 10, 11 characters at the most. It seems to me that you would probably have gotten a lot of problems. Let's say if the show ran 8 years, it probably would have been really ragged after season 5 or 6, because how many, the basketball players are going to have the same thing. There's going to be, did I get the cheerleader pregnant? So do you think that maybe the show is remembered fondly because it only lasted 3 years? Either of you?
I think so, because with only 54 episodes, the quality remains high, even if it peaked in the 37th episode.
Yeah.
It's still, many shows went on too long. I think Happy Days from the same era as the
40-year-old biker Fonzie.
So certainly going back and binge watching it, I do think so. I think it was
Absolutely. No, I think that.
Go ahead, Harv.
Yeah, sorry.
Harv, go ahead. Finish your thought.
Yeah, complete agreement. Like I said, I was just going to say, I think that's true because going into the third season, the storyline started dropping. The acting wasn't as good. The drama wasn't as good. But I think they closed it out really well with that final episode. So I think they did themselves a service by just doing 3 seasons and calling it a day.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the actors that were the basketball players, and even some of the supporting adult actors there. So we did talk about Ken Howard. I had forgotten, just in looking it up, because the principal Willis was always this fellow Jason Bernard, and he was. And then I saw they had Ed Bernard, who was Ed. Which one? They were the two fellows named Bernard. One was a more well-known actor, but the second guy who replaced him seemed much more like an athlete, and he had a much better rapport with Ken Howard. Any thoughts about that character of the principal of the Carver High School?
Yeah, I thought he did a really good job. He was very, very passionate in the show, and that reflected in his acting, no doubt.
Yeah, it was Jason Bernard in just the pilot.
Okay.
And then Ed Bernard took over. Same last name, no relation, but apparently the two actors were very good friends. To see Ed Bernard in a film role before this, there's a lesser-known film, but very good, called Together Brothers. It's actually filmed down here in Galveston. I'm in Texas. And has choice role for Ed Bernard in that. But it did seem to me, I agree, that Ed Bernard seemed to have a much better rapport with Ken Howard, and just seemed had a little bit more, not a knock on Jason Bernard at all, but he just had a little bit more of the gravitas I would assign to a high school principal in that situation.
And then there's actress Joan Pringle, who played the vice principal and then later the principal, Sybil Buchanan. And if this had been a more serialized drama, a more soap opera-like drama, I think they tried somehow, or maybe the actors were just so good that there seemed to be some kind of sexual tension between her and Howard, but they weren't going to go there in 1978. But she was one of my favorite characters because she broke the mold of the sort of good Negro that at that time, she would stand up. She was fiery. She just wasn't, a female, version of, look who's coming to dinner. What are your thoughts, Hal, first on not Sybil Buchanan, Joan Pringle, who played Sybil Buchanan?
Definitely the banter between the two was borderline flirtatious at times.
And she was cute. She was very cute.
Yes. Yeah, there was the banter between them was fantastic. And of course, sometimes antagonistic, but softened over time. I had the good fortune, to expand on what you're saying, Ken Howard, for a time, was one of these celebrities on Hollywood Poker, which was a sadly short-lived online site. You probably know I play a lot in my spare time. And I played online there briefly. He was at my table for one cash game. Well, I got the chance to ask him 2 questions. And one of those 2 questions was, okay, Coach Reeves and Sybil, did anything ever happen? He put in the chat, no. The other question, well, hey, what would you ask Ken Howard if you had a chance to talk to him about the White Shadow? Of course, I had to ask him, did Thomas's shot go in or not? The autistic.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I remember that.
He said,
Oh,
of
my
course.
Harv, any thoughts from you about the actress?
Yeah, Joan's performance, she didn't play. She didn't play at all. She was straightforward, strict, and I like that. Play by the book, play by the rules, and she made sure that came across in all of her episodes.
Let's turn now to the actors who played the characters on the basketball team. Probably the most beloved, and probably, if you want to say a breakout star or close to it, was probably the character of Warren Coolidge, played by Byron Stewart. He was the largest character, tallest character, I should say. He was the one character on that team that supposedly had NBA chops, who was being scouted. He was the center of the team, both literally and the position that he played. And I thought he played sort of a big, lovable dope kind of character. I mean, he wasn't as smart as Thorpe or some of the other characters. And, he was easily sort of gulled into doing or going along with whatever schemes. He's certainly a fan favorite. Harv, tell me what your thoughts on the Coolidge character.
Coolidge you had to like immediately. I mean, he was like a guy you would want to be friends with. He's just so cool and smooth and funny too. Very funny guy. And yeah, I can see why his character was so popular. No doubt.
Hal?
I know that it kind of teetered on the edge of making him look like a terrible student at times, but there was a great second season episode where a transfer student comes in and subverts a lot of expectations. White guy from Idaho who is a can't miss, has a perfect transcript. The episode does not go where you're expecting. His transcript turns out to be a fraud. It's all teachers have just been passing him because it's easy to do so. He's reading at a 6th grade level, as it turns out, in the 12th grade, which is something that really did happen at times. But he was outshining Coolidge on the court after he transferred. But as it turns out, Coolidge is, well, for all that we thought, he's a far better student than this guy, and he ends up passing his biology test at the end of the episode to stay on the team. One other thing about how beloved Coolidge is, so beloved that he was brought back as Warren Coolidge, Byron Stewart was, on St. Elsewhere, and he had a recurring role as an orderly, with the storyline being that he had an injury to his knee in college, which derailed his playing career, and he got a job at the hospital. And there's a great cameo by Timothy Van Patten in one episode where Coolidge spots him and says, "Hey, Salami." And he says, "Nah, you got the wrong guy, pal." And he's in an elevator, the doors close, and he just goes back down. There's a great little, call back there.
Now, one of the two favorite characters of mine was Morris Thorpe, played by Kevin Hooks. And I go back to 1969, a Christmas special called JT that starred a young Kevin Hooks, a decade before The White Shadow. And it was one of those, socially conscious Christmas shows of that era. There was like the House Without a Christmas Tree, the Waltons pilot, that also dealt with Christmas. The actor himself, Kevin Hooks, I think was just really good at playing this character who probably over the course of the show had the most screen time, I would think. I haven't measured it, but he seemed to be maybe the central character. He wasn't as popular as the Coolidge character, but within the show's universe, he seemed to be the central character, and he was all the other characters were sort of attached to him. What is your take on that, Hal, on his character?
Well, definitely, as an audience member, a young audience member, I related to him a lot, particularly in a one episode where he's kind of overachieving on the court, but he's showing an aptitude for art off of it. This is another second season episode. The art teacher wants to push Coach Reeves into diffusing unrealistic expectations about basketball as a long-term career. He's not pro material, but he could well be, have a great art career ahead of him should he pursue it. She's getting resistance not only from the coach, but from Thorpe's father, who has this, kind of has unrequited dreams of court glory for himself, and is kind of living through his son on that. And he tended to get a lot of the more interesting storylines. He wasn't just completely luckless like Curtis Jackson, unfortunately, would be, but he would get a lot of the more uncommon storylines to basketball.
Harv, what are your thoughts on Kevin Hookson, the character?
Yeah, that one episode that Hal was talking about, that was a really good episode, and I liked the conversation that Coach Reeves had with him about you're not good enough to be pro, and he just didn't want to believe it. And then the scene where his father finally succumbed to his ability to do art, that was really good. He did a very good job in his role.
Now, the other one of my two favorite characters on the team was Thomas Carter's James Haywood. And Haywood, Coolidge was the most popular character. Thorpe seemed to be narratively the central character, but Haywood was definitely the most mature of the characters, and he was also the leader on the court for them. And interestingly, both he and Carter became well known as TV directors over the next 40 years. Thoughts, Harv, from you on the Haywood character and Thomas Carter?
Well, yeah, he definitely showed a very high level of maturity in that show, how he took care of his little brother and, was trying to take care of his family at home, and it was always trying to do the right thing, both on the streets and in school and home. I think he was definitely the role model of that entire show.
Hal?
Yeah, Hayward, this was a show that never skimped on the humor. Often it came from the camaraderie rather than anything in the storyline. But to me, the single most intense, dramatic episode, one that honestly had very little humor to it and was jarring as a result, was the one where Hayward goes after a drug dealer in season 2. And that, he's very close to just ditching school and going all Paul Kersey on this guy. Mm-hmm. And even to the point that he got into an altercation with Coach Reeves, who was trying to stop him. Briefly, they broke a store window out and shoved him away. That was probably the standout episode for Thomas Carter as Haywood to me, but he was also central to the pilot, and they would explore a lot of unusual areas with him too. Later on, he becomes the friend for a Russian player wanting to defect. I didn't particularly care for that storyline. I didn't think this was the right show for that, but they handled it about as well as I guess you could have. And in both that and the Needle episode that I mentioned, you learn some things about Hayward that might have surprised you if you'd been following the series from the beginning.
Harv, comments from you?
Yeah, that Russian episode, uh, um, it was interesting, but again, with like Hal said, it was not done real well. It could have been done differently, absolutely. Um, but I like the way they Hayward. It made me laugh that when he asked them to exchange mailing addresses, he says, "I don't write letters." So, but in the end, he ended up taking his address. So that was kind of a pretty neat catch-22 there.
So you mentioned Tim Van Patten. He's one of the two or three white characters on the show, and oddly enough, I always found it just odd because he was this. He looked like a Hitler Youth child, with the pale skin, blonde, and yet he's playing an Italian, and it's Timothy Van Patten of Dutch origin. That and the fact that I thought he was Dick Van Patten's son, but it turns out he was the half brother. That was a character that I thought had a few moments there, but interestingly, had the situation been reversed and it had been a more all-white show, that's the way he's the kind of character that most black characters are written. That they have one or two moments each show where they do something stupid or something, and Salami was that basic character. Would you agree, Hal, that he was sort of almost an inverse of the way black people were on television for decades?
Yes. Yeah, and probably intentional given where Paltrow went with a lot of the show. Salami was one of the characters who did not graduate after season 2 and returned for season 3. And therefore, one of the standouts in that third season was an episode in which in a basketball game after he turns 18, there's an on-court fight. And in the melee, he punches a player on another team who gets his jaw broken, having surgery, and Salami is actually jailed and charged with assault. Which it's one of the better offerings from that season, which, as we've already mentioned, didn't measure up to the first or second season, but another issue that was explored, and I think it was well done. And going back to the first season, an episode that centers on him is titled "The Great White Dope," which amplifies what we thought. And it's about him going into club boxing because he was trying to follow in his father's footsteps. And what I liked about that episode is, as was what we got used to with the White Shadow, there were no easy solutions at the end of it. The reconciliation between son and father was father seeing him in there getting beat up, and rather than stopping the fight, or he goes in there and he says, "Hey, what are you doing? You need to," he goes up to the ring between rounds and gives him advice on how to improve. Now get out there and
Yeah, that was one of my favorite episodes as well, because I'm a huge boxing fan. So I thought that was a really cool episode. And then when they brought Carlos Palomino onto the show, I was like, oh man,
Yes.
That's wild. The real Carlos Palomino's on the show, and giving him advice and whatnot. Yeah, I thought that was a really good episode as well, and how he wanted to be a pro boxer, and he was doing it all the wrong way. And even Reeves ended up trying to help him do it the right way, if this is what he wanted to do.
So the last of the basketball characters that I would consider the sort of the tier 1 characters, at least in the first 2 seasons, was the character of Milton Reese, played by Nathan Cook. And my memory of the Cook character was he was sort of the guy who in the shower room was singing the Motown songs. He was sort of the leader of that, and he had a few good episodes, as I recall. But then I remember when the show got canceled a year or two later, I think he was on the show Hotel as being the top purser or whatever the title is there, and I'm like, it was so antithetical to the character that, I mean, the character of Reese didn't get as much feature time as Haywood or Coolidge or Thorpe. but still he had some good episodes. And then he's playing this sort of soulless character, and I thought, oh God, the life of an actor, to go from a character like Reese to just this lapdog character on a Dynasty ripoff kind of thing. How thoughts on Reese? And I think he died, the actor, very young. He had a stroke or something in the 80s.
Yeah, I don't know what Nathan Cook died of, but yeah, it was in the mid to late 80s, and he was only about 37 or 38. Yeah, very sad. I think he had some kind of heart genetic condition to do with his heart, not, and it was just, I guess, undiagnosed for a long time, as these things sadly go.
And I think he was the oldest cast member too. I think he was like 29 or 30 when he was the show aired.
Yeah, no show was immune to that, as we've mentioned. But his character was, as you mentioned, the driving force of the singing, and was an aspiring singer. Harv, you mentioned the final episode, and we'll come back to this again when we talk about others, but it gives us a chance to catch up on those who graduated. It was very neat. I don't know that it was intended to be the series finale, but he has a very interesting day when he comes back for the alumni game. He gets to taxi around. He's driving a cab while he pursues a singing career post-graduation, and he gets to taxi around a famous singer played by Ella Fitzgerald and spend the day with her. That's when he visits Curtis Jackson's grave. He's taking her to a funeral.
Right.
Harv, comments?
Yeah, watching the shows again, I had forgotten about all this singing, and that really kind of caught me by surprise because they were good.
Yeah. Or it could just have been the bathroom acoustics.
So I thought that was really cool.
And
it's funny because when I saw Ella Fitzgerald come on,
hello, you can hear us, Harv? Harv?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, because were you going to say something?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just saying when Ella Fitzgerald's character came on and they gave her.
All right, so let's talk about Curtis Jackson because he's maybe the well, I mean, he's sort of a secondary character. Before what I remember is the character was the most driven. He was the most most emotional of the characters there. He seemed to be the one that veered off more, and then they killed him off as part of the show. Hal, any comments about the actor or the character, Eric Kilpatrick?
Yeah, Kilpatrick's performance was terrific. Very accomplished actor, and he had a wide range of emotions to convey in this particular character. The one thing that strikes you rewatching it, every time I binge watch it, is just how star-crossed. It's almost like he was destined to meet an early end. And he had an alcohol problem in the very beginning, which then later on his ex-girlfriend, very well played by Debbie Morgan in this memorable episode, has moved away from Carver, and unknown to him, she's now a prostitute. And he's still in love with her and hoping to reconcile. That's truly the saddest episode. Then just all kinds of star-crossed things happen to him. He gets hooked up with gamblers in the second season opener, and as a result, chokes because he's trying too hard to make the free throws to win an early game there. Just really gets crossed up. Everything just star-crossed for him. It's still a jolt when he is killed senselessly in a simple robbery from being in the wrong place at the wrong time, though.
Harv, your thoughts?
Yeah, I kind of thought he was just like a carefree kind of character, throw caution to the wind, always joking and playing around. So for him to be written off the show the way he was, yeah, it was a little bit of a surprise. But I had known it was coming. I just didn't know what that episode it was in. Going back to Nathan Cook real quick, I just looked it up. He died from an accidental penicillin overdose.
Oh, wow.
So that's how he passed.
Okay, so he must have been
Okay.
allergic
Yeah.
to it.
I wasn't
Yeah,
sure what it was. That's a
accident.
real shame.
All things. Hmm.
So,
Yeah, I just looked on Wikipedia, accidental penicillin overdose. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Harv, you had mentioned that the actor Ira Angustain, who played Gogo Gomez, the lone Mexican player on the team, might be watching this. So, hello there, Ira, if you're watching. And now he I guess would be the first of the regular characters I would definitely put as a secondary character. I think he had maybe 2 or 3 episodes where he was featured or played a prominent role. And it's hard for me to remember. I don't think he had any show that dealt with things to the degree as Thorpe or Coolidge or Hayward. Harv, what is your take on the character of Gogo?
Well, he did have that one episode where his father was beating him up.
Okay.
And so you're dealing with domestic abuse there. And I like the way Coach Reeves stepped into his father and said, he was ready to throw a punch at him if he didn't knock it off. Because Gogo was coming into the locker room with bruises, marks all over his body, and he's trying to excuse it away. But I thought it was neat that he finally got the courage to get his mother and his sister out of the house and away from all of that. But yeah, he was the one character. I was trying to find some of the other actors to let them know about our panel discussion today, and he was the only one I could find, and he's a preacher out in California. And so I found him through his church and sent him an email, and he responded, yeah, I'm the guy. I told him about the panel discussion, and he says, yeah, I would love to watch it or listen to it when it's all done. So I told him I would send him a link when we're done.
Okay, cool.
Awesome.
Hal, any thoughts on Gogo Gomez from you?
Yeah, he also had a showcase episode in season 1 where Gomez considers rejoining his old street gang when things are not looking good at school. It's quite a development and maturity for him from season 1 to season 2, essentially becoming the head of his family to protect his mother and sister from his abusive father. And then in season 3, when we catch up with him after graduation, he's about to become a father at the time of their alumni game, and his wife is about to give birth, as it turns out. One thing, going back to The Hitter, which is the second season episode you mentioned, Harv, I was a little taken aback in the beginning where he and his father are actually attending a cockfight. I thought, well, I don't think prime time would dare to do this today.
Well, it actually was still going on when I was a kid in the 60s and 70s. There were still cockfights going on in Brooklyn. So in a sense, that was fairly realistic, and people would bet on it like they would the horses.
Yeah, sadly, they were going on
I'm just looking
in
at what in
southern Oklahoma not long before I was
right,
born.
and look at Michael Vick 15, 20 years ago, whatever, with dog fighting.
Yeah, it's realistic. I just thought I'm just amazed that CBS dared to let them do this.
So let's talk about.
Well,
go ahead, Harv.
I was just going to say, it makes you think of All in the Family. That show would never fly today.
Although it would be interesting to see Archie Bunker's take on Trump.
Oh my God!
But the last of the main characters, or the core characters of the first couple of seasons, was Ken Michelman's Abner Goldstein, and he was the lone Jewish character. And oddly, when looking it up, supposedly he was the sort of young avatar for Ken Howard as a high school player, meaning that people have associated that character with being the closest to Ken Howard, not because he was Jewish. I don't think Howard was Jewish, but because I guess he was just sort of an average bench player. Harv, what is your take on the Goldstein character?
Well, it's interesting. I found out that he also played basketball, and even more interesting and a bit of trivia here is that he was a teammate of Sinbad's, the comedian.
Ah,
They both played basketball together. I had no idea. And I also didn't realize how tall he was. He was actually pretty tall. I think he was like 6'6",
hmm.
Michael. And,
Well, Coolidge was the
but
tallest of the
yeah,
actors, but Byron Stewart rather. But yeah, I think he might have been the second tallest after Stewart.
yeah, yeah. So I thought his character was played really well. He was so straightforward and straight-laced. That made it kind of interesting, especially his relationship with his grandparents who he lived with, um, and following, his religious beliefs and everything else. I thought it was pretty neat.
And I think that the actor, not the character, the actor, like Howard, also went on to stage work. I could be wrong, but I think I read that in looking up for it. Hal, any thoughts about the Michaelman actor and his character?
Goldstein's character arc was quite interesting and I think satisfying because real life happens a lot like this. In season 1 and season 2, he's definitely, at the bottom of the roster player on the team and gets a lot of pranks pulled on him. He's the one getting stuffed into a locker, or if he orders a pie, getting his face shoved into it at a diner, just to name two that I revisited here. But after graduation, and he had a scholarship, you'll remember at the end of season 2, but he ends up joining the Marines. And when he comes back for the alumni game, he's buff, the glasses are gone, the uniform's on, and he now has the confidence to approach that girl in high school that he never could work up the courage to even say hello to before. And it works out a lot like that. It's this show's gentle reminder that high school and the real world are two very different things.
So, of the lesser characters who came on as replacements for the characters that graduated, the three that stood out to me, but again, they were not the top tier characters, were John Mangotti as Nick Vitalia, an Italian kid from New York. Larry Flash Jenkins played Wardell Stone. And the other one that stands out to me, not because of anything he did on this show, was Stoney Jackson as Jesse Mitchell. And I remember Stoney Jackson later had a show in the mid-'80s that was called The Insiders, where he played a detective. Mm-hmm. So he might have been the only actor from all of those characters that on that team that became a lead actor, at least in one television series later. Let me ask you, Hal, then, of any of those characters, and there's also characters, there was John Loughlin as Patty Fallahay, I don't remember him, and also Wolf Perry as Teddy Ruthwood. I don't really remember those characters that well. Of these replacement characters, did any stand out to you, Hal?
I don't, and I don't think it's the fault of the actors, but season 3, it's easy to forget this, but 1980 and 81 was a truncated TV season in many ways because there was an actor strike that lingered far longer. There were a lot of delayed premieres. A lot of the returning shows did not even premiere until December 1980 with new episodes. So you had a two-parter where the coach goes back home, learns his father is dying, and you learn a little bit more about Coach's background, and you have that later episode catching up with everybody. So you got a shortened season to begin with, and there just weren't that many episodes in between to showcase a lot of the new characters.
Yeah.
Again, probably to their detriment. Coolidge and Salami were still in high school. They had not graduated, and they each had a couple of episodes centering around them. But yeah, it kind of hurt. I think the truncated season really hurt in their effort to, get these newer characters a little more front and center time to develop.
Harv, any thoughts or any moments that stick out to you with these secondary characters?
Yeah, and I don't remember the characters too well, but John my God, when he came on the show, it was like oh my God, that New York accent. Having spent time up there, I know it's just like it became very familiar. I was like, gosh, I've heard that accent a million times, but he did that. I mean, he is from New York, so uh, but that was just typical New York accent. So I got a kick out of that.
So Hal, you mentioned the actor strike in 80 81, and that seemed to be the death knell for this show. It seemed to be running out of gas. That was the coup de grace. Or was there any other reason that the network didn't want to renew it?
Um, it was never really highly rated. There was always some tough competition on the other networks. It aired. It was either airing on Monday night against Little House on the Prairie or Tuesday night against ABC's still formidable Happy Days led lineup, even at that late date. So the ratings were always middling. I think that may have been a sense that it was running out of gas. In a way, I'm kind of glad because I am not sure that the new characters were ever going to endear themselves as much as those that we got to know in seasons 1 and 2. I think it may have kept the quality of this show at the level that we remember for it to only go 3 seasons.
Harv, any thoughts from you on its cancellation?
Well, on Hal's point you just made, yeah, the initial core of characters was so solid, and I don't think they would have ever been able to do better than those first 2 seasons of characters replacing them. So I mean, it had a good 2.5 3 year run. I think it was terminated when it should have been. It's now etched in our memories just for that short lifespan it had, no doubt.
So one of the more interesting things about the show is that in its afterlife in syndication, it was sold around the world, and it's credited with starting a revolution in, of all places, Turkey, becoming one of the great feeder nations of talent to the NBA, and arguably, who knows? I don't know if it did it in the Baltic states or the rest of Europe as well, perhaps. Harv, let me start with you. Is that true that the show had a great influence in Turkey and maybe possibly in the rest of Europe?
Well, that would be the first I've ever heard that, but I know that European basketball players just became unbelievably talented over the years, and you can look at the NBA now and see so many of them. And the thing about European players, I believe, is that they just play such fundamental basketball, as opposed to the United States, where it's more flashy and they run different kinds of offenses than they would over in Europe. So I think European players in the NBA did the NBA a huge justice by coming over and playing.
Yeah, the NBA where 7 steps and you're still not traveling. But Hal,
Right.
Hal, let me ask you: do you know anything about the Turkey connection?
I had heard this mentioned before, and I never really looked into it, but like you, Dan, I had heard it. Just don't really have too much to say other than that, but never really looked into that. But that is interesting to think about.
So we've talked about a bit of the history, the background of the show, some of the main characters. When I look back on the show, it's hard for me to think of a particular episode because that was my favorite, simply because the show did have this gravitas of reality. I mean, yes, you're looking on screen and it's not real, but unlike say Laverne and Shirley, or even some of the episodes. If you watch The Waltons, that was 40 or 50 years before it aired. If you watch shows like Little House on the Prairie, that's 100 years before it was aired. If you watch Dynasty, that's just the glitzy soap opera. So there's no facade of reality to sort of cloud it. So in my mind, when you've been talking about some of these things, I'm like, oh, I remember this thing, but I don't know which episode it was from. It almost makes you think about the show as you would if you had been a character experiencing it. So it's hard for me to pick an episode because of that, because I can't think of, like, if I think of the original Star Trek, I can say, oh, this episode where Kirk went and did this, or that episode where Scotty beamed them up in just the nick of time or whatnot. Let me ask you, Hal, do you have particular episodes that stick in your mind, or is it sort of the whole thing at once kind of thing with me?
I think it's as a whole, but you've heard me bringing up quite a few episodes throughout this. I'll mention a few here that I had not brought up yet. They're excellent episodes, and they're also ahead of their time in what they were tackling. There's an episode called Links where the coach takes the guys to play golf. He's trying to interest them in individual sports, and they find out that it's a racially exclusive country club. And I mean, this is in 1980. A decade later, this would become a hot topic. With the Masters being held at Augusta, and they're earlier in that season, I think I touched on this when talking about Curtis Jackson, but on the line where he gets involved with bookies who, hoodwink him into betting on his own team, and then they want him to help throw a game later. Now, obviously,
I do remember that one, yeah.
Yeah, a decade later, we had the situation with Pete Rose. In that episode, the coach brings up the NFL situation in the 60s with Alex Karras, where he said these guys lost a year of their career because of what you're doing.
Yeah.
They didn't bet against their team either. So maybe it was ahead of its time in a lot of ways when you watch it now, but those two stick out to me along with some of the others that I've brought up. Honestly, if I didn't want to get, if I wanted to get long-winded, I could probably come up with 4 or 5 other standouts right now.
And it just occurred to me, wasn't there an early episode that was focused on Ken Reeves, the coach, where after, it might have been like only 5 or 6 episodes into this series, where some rival coach or whatnot wanted to recruit him to coach another team, and so Ken had to make the choice of whether he was going to be an educator, or go help these kids in their lives, or whether he was just going to ascend the rung to become an NBA coach.
We had there was a larger school trying to recruit him but before the city championship took place because of his success at Carver with great facilities, and he decided to stay. But there was a rival coach who tried to recruit Reese, I believe, in an early season 2 episode, and succeeded in drawing him over to their team, where Reese finds himself trapped. He wants to go back. He says it's not working out. Coach said, tough luck. You're here, and you either play here or you play for nobody. Fortunately, an assistant there helped Reeves out in diffusing the situation, getting him back to Carver. But that could be one that you're, as far as a rival coach goes, because that did happen.
Yeah, I may be mixing and matching.
Reeves players.
Yeah.
Reese, yeah.
Harv, any standout episodes that you want to mention?
There's so many good ones. It's hard to point your finger at one, but as far as relating to the show, like I said early on in this discussion, that I found out Timothy Van Patten, the show came out in 78, and he's my age, same age. He's 66 this year. So it made it very easy to relate to the show because at the time that the show came out, he's about 16, 17 years old, so I was on.
Yeah.
So a lot of the cars, the clothes, the people that are in the school, it felt like I was also back in high school because I just got out of high school.
Yeah.
So it was very cool in that sense.
So this episode will be called "Why the White Shadow is Great." Let me ask you to answer that question then, Harv. In whether your personal opinion, or if you look at it from a sports perspective or a social realist perspective, if you were, being asked to talk to whether it's a critic or a young person, why this show is great, why they should watch it, what would you say?
I would say watch the show so you can learn life lessons that don't exist anymore. A lot of those storylines were just honest social issues, personal issues, and it's growing up the right way. And I think we lack that in a big way these days in this current state of society, no doubt about it.
Hal, same question for you. Why is the White Shadow great, and in whatever form you want to tackle that?
Well, we've gone into detail about how well written and acted and ahead of its time it is. What sets it apart for me, and this is not to disparage the two examples I'm going to bring up, but Lou Grant and Quincy would get on the soapbox all the time.
Yeah.
The White Shadow explored these topics, but they did not get preachy about it, and they did not offer pat solutions. It never got in the way of the entertainment or the quality of the show. I really never saw Coach Reeves get on the soapbox in rewatching this at all. They could explore a topic and do it with nuance. And to be able to do that while maintaining such a high level of acting and writing, it's really rare. And that's what makes this show such a largely undiscovered gem these days. If somebody runs across it, I think they'll be very pleasantly surprised if they stick with it a few episodes.
And the characters would fail. Coach Reeves failed, and there wasn't a very special episode. That was just life.
Not really.
Harv, did you have a final comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say Coach Reeves, he came across as somebody that really cared about his players.
Yeah.
And the one episode where he brought on that player that his parents did not want him to play because they were worried about his health, and the kid ended up having a heart attack or a heart failure, and Coach Reeves was so torn up about it. It felt like he was so responsible, so guilty, and that just showed the kind of character they were trying to show you that he was. Caring, very caring.
And what was realistic about it, the parents, the grieving parents were very realistically portrayed. You could tell the father was trying to be the rock and be more balanced. Mother, on the other hand, was unforgiving. Even at the end of the episode, she looks right at Coach Reeves and says, "You killed my son."
Yeah, you got to live with this the rest of your life.
Yeah, great performance by Madge Sinclair, but really wasn't she always great? She could get her own podcast.
Well, I want to thank both of you for spending over an hour talking about the White Shadow. Harv, Abstract Sports, that's your website. That I'll link to your page there.
I write for actually 3 sites, Abstract Sports. I also write for one called Yins Are Crazy. It's all Pittsburgh sports. And I write for a third one called Sick Podcast. And I think that's where you found me at, Dan, when I wrote the article about the White Shadow.
Okay.
So if anybody wants to look at that, you just go to sickpodcast.com and you'll find it in there under the basketball category. And then I also write for Gridiron Greats, a football magazine, a quarterly magazine.
And Hal, you're at the Horn section on Blogspot. I'll link to that.
Yeah, hornsection.blogspot.com.
And thanks again for your insights.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.